Hello, I'm Janice Heppenstall and I'm a professional genealogist based on the Isle of Wight. In this video I'm going to talk about the Rotton and Pocket boroughs of the Isle of Wight, but first we need to set the scene with some context. So, since some of that context relates to the whole of the UK, there's a chance that it might apply to your places too. So I've prepared a blog post with lots of links and information to help you to work out if any of this applies to your place. And shortly after this video publishes, there'll be a link in the comments below it to take you directly to that specific post. So I hope you'll find that helpful. What we're going to be talking about here is the unreformed House of Commons. That means the House of Commons as it was before the Great Reform Act of 1832. And as I've said, it therefore applies to the whole of the United Kingdom. There were two parallel voting systems at this time. Each county elected two Knights of the Shire to represent its interests in Parliament, and the Knights of the Shire were prominent local landowners. They were elected by significant freeholders, which was taken from 1429 to mean those who own freehold property valued for the land taxed at 40 shillings a year or more. But alongside this, some towns or boroughs could elect burgesses to represent their town's specific interests. And these would be wealthy merchants or lawyers or master craftsmen, people who had a stake in their town and wanted it to succeed. And these sat together in what was from 1544 known as the House of Commons. But not all towns were boroughs. And not all boroughs were parliamentary boroughs. It depended on whether or not they had a charter and what was the nature of that charter. So a charter could be granted by a local lord or a bishop or the monarch, and it gave them the right to hold markets and fairs or to have a corporation with elected officials, or the right to establish trade schools. It's all about local arrangements, and this charter that you see here is that kind of local arrangement charter. So it's for Newport, Isle of Wight, and it dates from around 1180. But to be a parliamentary borough, which gave the right to send elected burgesses to the House of Commons, like we've just seen, what they needed was a royal charter, and that could be granted to any settlement, regardless of its size or importance, but only by the monarch. And the individual charters would also set out the voting arrangements because they were different for everyone. But broadly speaking, they fell into these six categories: householders, freemen, freeholders, Scot and Lot, which was about ratepayers, burgage boroughs, and corporation boroughs. And in the blog post that I mentioned, you'll find links to definitions and explanations of these and lots of other information. So you can find out more about all of them, but right now we're homing in on burgage boroughs and corporation boroughs, because as you can see, the examples I've given here, Newtown, Newport and Yarmouth, they're all on the Isle of Wight, and they are in fact our three Rotton and Pocket boroughs of the Isle of Wight. So what do we mean by Rotton and Pocket boroughs? Well, these were terms that came to be used in the 18th century by people who were demanding reform, and as it happens, they were all in England. A Rotton borough was a parliamentary borough with a tiny electorate, which often came about through changes in population, migration and so on, but not always. Some of them were tiny from the outset. And because of their small size, they were easily controlled by the landholders who used financial or territorial means, gratuities, bribery, coercion, whatever. A pocket borough, also called a nomination borough, was controlled by one person or perhaps by a corporation. Often they were burgage boroughs, and they were controlled by a landlord owning more than half of the burgage holdings, and there'll be more about that shortly. Now, obviously, this meant that the landowners somehow benefited. So how come? Well, it gave them extra influence in the House of Commons. If they were peers, then it meant that they already had influence in the House of Lords, so now they had influence in both houses. Some of them stood themselves as MPs, or they gave the seat to a family member. But in addition, financially, it was a valuable asset because this interest in a safe seat could be sold to a candidate of the landowner's choice. So, for example, in 1767, the price for a safe seat was £3,000 to £5,000 just for that one election. So here we are now on the Isle of Wight, and I've pointed out with these blue arrows the location of the three boroughs. So there's Newport in the centre of the map. Moving out west, there's Newtown, and further west, there's Yarmouth. And in 1584, all three were granted charters by Elizabeth I, giving them the right to send 2 elected burgesses each to the House of Commons. Now today Newtown looks like this, and if you look at the image top right, you'll see a leafy lane with one house. There's a number of very nice houses along there. It's a very tranquil, peaceful place. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, it was very different. It was a thriving commercial centre, and it benefited from this large, safe, natural harbour that you can see. And there were oyster beds. There was prosperous salt works, and what you can see lower left there is a salt urn which still remains, and it would have been used to harvest salt as the tides came in. Lower right there you can see Newtown Town Hall, and this particular building dates from around 1699, although it's likely that an official building has existed on this site since the 13th century. But back then it would have been on a broad street and surrounded by houses. Now it's surrounded by fields. But in 1377, a French raid totally destroyed the town and it never recovered. But despite this, Elizabeth I awarded those 2 parliamentary seats. So in the 18th century, Newtown was described as a decayed place with only about 10 houses and very few inhabitants. In 1729, it was clarified that it was a burgage borough, and that meant the franchise rested in the property, not the person, and that made the burgage freeholds valuable. Now, if you look at the map there, you can see individual plots. There were 39 of them, and they are the burgage holdings. They're the burgage plots. So burgages, whenever there was a burgage borough, burgages were acquired specifically for the franchise by landed gentry, and then they would install in them the people that they trusted to vote how they wanted. And because of that, they were often pocket boroughs, because anybody who owned more than half of them effectively controlled the borough. Well, the landowners, the important local landowning families you can see here, Barrington, Holmes, Worsley, Oglander and Lee, I'm sure that they would each have loved for it to have been a pocket borough. They would have loved to have owned 50% of the plots, but unfortunately for them, none of them ever did. So instead, it was more about negotiations and just sort of making agreements. And in fact, in 1768, there were 37 transfers of the burgages in the 3 months before the election, as they all tried to get in place the people that they knew would vote the way that they wanted to vote. Before the mid-18th century, it was really the Barrington and Holmes family that sort of nominated who would stand. But for a little later in the century, it was Barrington and Worsley. And in fact, from 1790, they didn't even bother with elections. They just put forward the candidates they wanted. So it might surprise you to know that this decayed place was actually represented twice by future Prime Minister George Canning in the 1790s and again in 1806 to 1807. Moving on now to Yarmouth, what we can see here is Yarmouth Castle, which was an artillery fort built by Henry VIII in 1547. And as we know, there was a need for an artillery fort. It was of strategic importance for defending the island and the south of England. At around that time, there was about 26 houses, and then 1584, it got its charter from Elizabeth I. So There was some increase in the size of the population after that, 50 houses in 1766, and by 1831 there was 114 houses, population just below 600, and 21 voters. Now this was a corporation borough, which meant the right to vote vested in the mayor and burgesses, and there's the town hall there that you can see where all of the discussion and so forth would have taken place. Now it was controlled by members of the important local landowning families. You've met them all already except for Jervis, that's a new one here. Now they were the mayors, they were the chief burgesses, they controlled the whole thing, but the reason they did it was not about love of Yarmouth so much as protecting their parliamentary interests, so which they had to do via the corporations, so they were the corporation, and the records of proceedings do actually bear this out. They do mostly relate to election of burgesses and mayors and MPs, and there's rarely any practical business serving the needs of the town. Newport now, so here is a 1611 map, so not long after the granting of the representation, the charter. The map is the town of Newport at that time, which specifically excluded some of the town streets, so it was a little bit smaller than what you can actually see there. And you can see from the arrow where I was standing and where I was pointing the camera when I took the photograph. You can see in the photograph the church over the rooftops. So this photograph pretty much describes the extent of the borough as it was before 1832. Population 1791 2778, and by 1831 just under 4,400. We've got the same local landowning families. There's a new one there, Dillington, and like Yarmouth, this was a corporation borough. Now, throughout the 18th century, the borough was managed for the government by the Holmes family. So what does that mean? Well, in return for providing safe seats for men of the government's choice, they received favours for the town, and undoubtedly that would also have included sinecures for the families and their members. Now this didn't just happen on the Isle of Wight, and it didn't just happen in Rotten and Pocket boroughs. It was a nationwide thing, but those who defended the system said it benefited the country because locally elected burgesses focused on the needs of their town, but the country needed men with political ambition who would be concerned with matters of state, and Newport got them. So you can see 4 future prime ministers represented Newport: Lord Palmerston, Duke of Wellington, George Canning, who had previously represented Newtown, and Viscount Melbourne. And clearly there was no great attachment to the Isle of Wight intended, and they rarely, if ever, visited. So reform was needed. By the late 18th century, the corporations were just vehicles for returning members to Parliament, and they hardly ever met other than that. But even that, election of the MPs was in the hands of 4 people, so those corporations and so on were controlled by 4 people. And through those 4 people, the government ministers generally got the election of their favoured candidates. If we just do a bit of population comparison, the total for all 3 Isle of Wight boroughs was 5,050. If you compare that to the populations of Manchester, Birmingham and Leeds, none of them had a single elected representative, but those 3 boroughs on the Isle of Wight had a total of 6. So the 1832 Reform Act disenfranchised 56 Rotten and Pocket boroughs, and that included Newtown and Yarmouth, but Newport itself remained a parliamentary constituency until 1884. Then it too was disenfranchised. Well, I hope that this might have given you some ideas to look at your places from this political perspective and how this might have impacted on life there. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.